So it's about 3 minutes past, so I think we should get started. People will just join in. So again, to those who have just joined, I am 𝗂𝗧 and I am from Denmark, and I am a part of, or a member of Effective Altruism Denmark, and I will be your hostess today. So to begin with, we just want to say thank you to some organizations, so like Animal Ethics, who have been so kind to let us borrow Aditya for today's talk. We'll also like to say thank you to the Danish Vegetarian Society, who has let us borrow their Zoom account. And we also want to say thank you to the local effective altruist groups of Northern Cyprus, the Philippines, Estonia, as well as Hungary and Croatia. And also to Effective Altruism Anywhere and the Positive Impact Society Erasmus. All to you, thanks for sharing the event on Facebook. And on to some pragmatics before we start with the program is we will be recording this event today, and hopefully we will be able to share it with you on email so that you can rewatch it if you like, or if you know someone who couldn't join us today, you can share it with them and they can see the talk. And the other thing I just want to let you know really quickly is that we will be using Slido for the Q&A session. And so we will link to Slido in the chat now. So if you could all just quickly open Slido via the link in the chat. So open Slido, which you can find a link to in the chat. And in Slido, you will be able to ask questions to Aditya from now on, and also upvote the best questions or the questions that you would most like to hear the answer to. And in that way, we will make sure that the most popular and important questions get asked first. So onto the program. So I'll very shortly introduce to you effective altruism for those who don't know what effective altruism is. I will then continue to introduce you to our speaker, Aditya, and the organization that he is from, Animal Ethics. Then we'll pass the mic over to Aditya for the exciting talk on wild animal suffering and ways to help. And then we will do the Q&A session. And after the Q&A session, for those who want to dive deeper into today's topic, they can join local discussion groups where they can discuss the topic further or ask questions about effective altruism. So what effective altruism is that it is a philosophy, it's a social movement, and a global community of people who wants to make the world a better place. But what sets effective altruism apart from other social movements is the emphasis on effectiveness. So that means that we use evidence and reason to determine what is the most good, and then also doing the most good that we can possibly do with like the limited resources that we have available to us. And so what effective altruists typically do is they identify a problem where a lot of individuals are suffering. And so we'll ask questions such as how many individuals are affected by a specific problem? So is it 1,000 or maybe 50 billion? And then we also ask how neglected is this problem? So how many or how few people are currently working to solve this problem? And then we ask, what can we do about it? And how can we do something about it in the best way and most effective way possible? So we are following a set of guiding principles. And the first one is the commitment to others. And that means taking the well-being and suffering of others seriously, and then taking significant personal actions to help and benefit others. So in essence, it's about actively doing something to help and benefit others. And we also follow the principle of having a scientific mindset. So that means using evidence, reason, and rationality to decide what to focus on, and then how to most effectively do some good, or the most good that we can possibly do. So for example, say I had $500 and I could donate those to, say, a local animal shelter and maybe save 5 animals. And that's really great. But if I sat down and did some research and I found out that I could save many more animals by donating to a charity that works on solving the problem of suffering in animal agriculture, well, that would be even better. So that leads us to the next guiding principle, which is openness. And being open, and that means like being open to changing our path, our beliefs, and our actions if we are provided with solid evidence and good arguments in favor of doing that, in order for us to like make the world a better place and benefit and help others in the most effective way. So in the chat, we'll link to some talks and great articles about effective altruism if you want to know more about this concept. We'll also link you to a sign-up sheet where you can sign up and then get in contact with your local EA group if you would like to become a part of EA and you like our principles and how we work. And so one organization that follows these principles is Animal Ethics. And Animal Ethics is an international animal advocacy organization based in the United States. And they're working to promote research on wild animal suffering. They also conduct and promote research interventions that aims to improve the lives of wild animals. Furthermore, they also provide free resources like articles, video courses, and article reviews for academics and animal advocates and the general public. So they also focus on increasing concern and respect for the situation of both animals in the wild and those animals that are exploited by humans through outreach, such as giving seminars and talks like this one. And so Aditya, who is our speaker, he's a spokesperson for Animal Ethics. And he's a long-term animal advocate in India, where he is working on spreading concern for animal suffering. And currently, he's also pursuing a degree in animal protection law at the National Academy of Legal Studies and Research in India. Also, he is an organizer for the city chapter of the Animal Save movement in India. So he's got a really impressive resume, and so this was some of the highlights. And I'll now pass on the stage to you, Aditya.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, 𝗬𝗓. And thank you all for attending this talk. It's really nice to see that people from all over the different time zones are attending this talk. Yeah, and before I begin, I would like to give you a brief introduction about what we're going to talk today. So as you all know, like this is going to be a talk where we'll explore what are the attitudes and relationships that are currently existing between humans and non-human animals. And we will also be exploring different ways in which animals suffer, which we hadn't previously considered. So today, to start, before we start, addressing the title of the talk, which is it ever okay for animals to suffer? Let us look at some of the biases that stop us from considering how animals are actually harmed or benefited by humans. So this brings me to speciesism. So speciesism is a form of discrimination against individuals of certain species or disadvantageous treatment or unjustified consideration of animals or individuals based on their species membership. This is similar to how we consider the prejudices of racism or sexism, where we discriminate individuals based on arbitrary reasons, like based on their skin color or based on their gender, which is not really relevant when we consider if we should morally value their experiences. So speciesism is, in short, it's a form of discrimination against those who don't belong to a certain species. Again, there are different forms of speciesism that are existing in our society today. It's very prevalent, and some of the forms of speciesism are anthropocentrism. This is a very widely held belief that the interests of humans matter more than that of animals. To be more specific, the interests of humans count more than equally strong interests of other animals. When we value human interests much higher than equally strong interests of animals. For example, an animal's interest in not suffering might sometimes be as strong as that of not the same interest of a human being. But when we arbitrarily value human beings, like when we consider their interest much higher than that of other species, then this is a form of anthropocentrism. Similarly, there are other forms of discriminations, like where we not only discriminate based on humans and animals, but also we discriminate between two different species of animals, where we consider one species to be of more value than the other species. So this can be for many reasons, like for aesthetic preferences, for example, a panda bear, where we consider a panda to be more morally valuable compared to for example, a sloth bear in some countries. So for aesthetic preferences, or it could be based on a scientific interest. Certain species of animals are more valuable for their conservationist status, because, for example, they are keystone species in a particular ecosystem. So it influences our attitudes towards these animals such that we value them more than other species which can equally, which have equally strong interests. So this is a second form of speciesism. Moving on, it can also be based on their size. So let me tell you, like when I ask you to imagine about a wild animal, usually, at least when I ask people to imagine about an animal living in the wild, the animals that they usually think of are, the large mammals or large terrestrial animals. Sometimes, they also think about animals which are more popular, like bats or whales, but it's usually larger animals. But majority of the animals living in the wild are small invertebrates. If we decided to map out the populations of animals living in the wild, majority of the animals that come into existence are the small invertebrates. So yeah, like even our availability bias, which we say, like when we choose to think of a particular species, what we can usually recall is the one we give more preference to. So similarly, this is the third form of speciesism. But again, the main point is, are these justified reasons when we are deciding whether to extend moral consideration to certain individuals? No. So the answer is sentience. What is sentience? Sentience is the capacity to feel pain or pleasure, to have balanced experiences, which is have well-being, positive or negative well-being, the capacity to suffer when, suffer in the sense having negative experiences. So sentience is the actually relevant property when we are deciding whether to give moral consideration to a particular individual or not. But how do we decide whether a particular being or an individual is sentient or not? So there are certain factors. So usually in the field of neurobiology or in many fields, when deciding if an animal is sentient or if an animal is capable of feeling pain or pleasure, they look at two major factors. One is the behavior of the animal. So it is not 100% possible to know if another species, an individual of another species, like for example, say a snake, for example, is 100% conscious and feeling pain or not. But what we can do is we can deduce that they are sentient from certain factors. So for example, with respect to behavior, if there is a forest fire, for example, a lot of animals flee away from the fire. They run away from the fire. For example, if there's a small injury, they try to tend to the injury. They try to escape from negative stimuli. So this is an evidence that, these animals are experiencing pain in a similar way how humans experience, at least similar way. And also the second factor which we can look at is physiology. So humans, for example, when we perceive pain, it's usually through our centralized nervous system. When we undergo a particular stimuli, it is processed by, the information is processed by our centralized nervous system. And in our brain, there are nociceptors on a particular site which deliver the pain message to our brain, and hence we experience pain. So we also see similar kinds of structures in different kinds of animals where they, for example, a cow has a centralized nervous system. It has a spinal cord and a centralized nervous system where the centralization happens in the brain, and that is where the capacity to feel pleasure or pain is existing even in other species. And it's not just limited to large mammals which you are familiar with. For example, it's important to also consider what animals are not sentient but living beings. This is an example of a sponge. It reproduces, it also respires, it takes in a lot of oxygen and releases carbon dioxide, but at the same time, it does not have any kind of a structure or any mechanism through which it can process information. So this is an example of a non-sentient being. Sentient beings are beings which have some kind of mechanism to kind of process pain or pleasure. Similarly, even hermit crabs, for example, arthropods and crustaceans like hermit crabs. For example, even an octopus, where it does react to pain and pleasure, and also it has the necessary structure where it feels pain. So even insects, for example, honeybees, right? So usually people have this belief that insects are very plastic in nature. They do not act based on any kind of experience. They are just, reacting, and they are not really conscious or sentient. But that's not truly the case. Insects like honeybees have shown to, have very complex behavior. For example, they have self-awareness. Like when they get into a hive, they have the awareness of the surroundings, where they are able to fold in their wings exactly according to the size of the dimensions of the hive hole. Similarly, to communicate to the rest of the hive, the distance for the food. For example, if it's a particular distance away, a honeybee will usually try to communicate it by rotating, by moving in a particular pattern, and trying to communicate the exact amount of distance where the food is available. So this has been studied, and there is a lot of evidence now that a lot of insects are also showing very complicated behavior, which is an evidence for their capacity to be sentient, which is to feel pleasure and pain and have experiences. Well, now we've seen two factors. One, which is their behavior. A lot of individuals have sentient individuals have behavior which can help us deduce that a particular being is sentient, and also their physiology. What if in the future, at least a lot of effective altruists think about a sentient AI? Maybe in the future, there might be artificial beings which humans have created, which also possess this capacity where, they have the physiological basis and also, the behavioral capacity to react to pain and to have pleasure. So yeah, it is very much possible that in the long-term future, maybe we might be able to engineer systems which are capable of feeling pain and pleasure. So what I'm trying to get at is, when we are deciding whether to grant moral consideration to a particular individual, what ultimately matters, what is the relevant factor when we are deciding to choose if a particular being should be considered and we should not harm them, is that they are sentient. So it can also include in the future probably beings, robots, for example, who are capable of feeling pain. So yeah, sentience is the relevant property when we are considering, whether to extend our moral consideration to animals. Right. So let me come to the topic of how animals are actually harmed, or how are they suffering. We are all aware that animals are harmed terribly by humans, where they are exploited for a number of reasons. For example, more than 2 trillion fish are killed every year worldwide, the wild-caught fish. If I include the farmed fish as well, then the number of beings that are exploited is much higher. And fishes do show, behavioral and physiological. They satisfy these two factors where they are sentient, and there is evidence that they do have the capacity to feel pain and suffer. So you can only imagine the terrible amount of suffering that exists when fishes are put into these tiny tanks where they do not have the factors necessary for their optimal well-being. So they do suffer in terrible ways, and they're also killed in terrible ways where they're asphyxiated to death. And also the chickens. So nowadays we can see the factory farms with the battery cages, where in a single cage more than 12 hens are packed into a single cage sometimes, and they usually are not able to exercise their physical interests, and they're not able to move properly, and they also die in very horrible ways. They get diseases. So more than 50 billion chickens are farmed worldwide every year, and approximately 20 billion other animals. This can be for many other reasons, for example, for clothing, for experimentation, for entertainment. So many animals are exploited by humans, and we are all usually aware about it. A lot of animal advocates are aware of how animals are harmed by humans. But is this the only way in which animals are harmed? Because usually advocates usually talk about animals only being exploited by human beings, but that's not really true. So speciesism is an unjustified belief, which is that we should not arbitrarily discriminate among two individuals just based on their species membership. So that means not only being against harming animals, but also in favor of helping them. For example, if there was a human being and he was drowning in a pond, irrespective of if you pushed him or if he fell down, due to natural causes, you would consider it an obligation to help him if it is possible to help him. So it does not only mean that, it's just not a negative duty that I should not push him into the pond, but also we have an obligation to help him when it is possible for us to help him. So yeah, so that helps me transition to the next topic, which is animals don't only suffer due to human anthropogenic causes or human caused problems, harms, but they also suffer a lot due to natural harms. There are many ways in which animals suffer in the wild, and I will just try to give you a brief about the different ways in which animals very commonly suffer in the wild, huge number of animals. So I just showed you the number of individual animals that are being exploited by humans, and you could see 3 trillion animals, 3 trillion fishes, and 50 billion hens, and the numbers seem so huge that we are not even able to grasp the amount of suffering involved in there. But in the wild, the number of animals is estimated to be close to 10 to the power 19. So that includes 1,000 billion mammals on an average. These estimates are very rough. An individual called Brian Tomasic tried to form like a broad estimate of possibly how many sentient animals exist in the wild. And if you consider the invertebrates, the number goes up to 10 to the power 19. So the gross estimate is around 9.1 into 10 to the power 19, which is such a huge number. So the number of individuals that are in the wild is so huge. So considering their, the amount of harms they undergo in the wild becomes, kind of very important. So animals, for example, suffer due to weather conditions, where there is a very strong, for example, snowstorm, and, they get injured or there's a frostbite, and they usually do not get access to any form of medical assistance. And also they suffer due to famines and starvation. Famines are very common in, the area surrounding the equator, where, every summer there is, and also due to climate change, their animals are not adapted to kind of, stay without food. They're not adapted to migrating. And deaths due to famine is very common. And also due to starvation. Starvation is a very, very painful way to die, where, the animals start consuming their own fat. They become incredibly weak, and, they usually die a very painful death. Similarly, talking about weather conditions, this is in Kaziranga National Park in India, where I stay, where floods are very common, where every year more than 95% of the national park is flooded with flood water. And animals usually try to migrate to the upper highlands, but most individuals are not able to migrate for many reasons, and they usually die. Last year there were more than 400 large mammals that were affected, but we don't usually consider also a lot of the smaller animals like the rats or the rabbits or the insects, which could also have been affected, harmed in such huge numbers. So yeah, floods are very common in different parts of the world where animals are harmed due to them. They drown, they die due to drowning. Similarly, diseases and parasitic infections, right? So they're very, very common. For example, this rabbit here is suffering from 𝗬𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗀ँ which is a very painful skin condition, which starts with huge blisters, and then animals usually die in very painful ways. So yeah, this is very common. Fungal infections, parasitic infections, they are one of the leading causes of animal suffering in the wild. And it's not just mammals that are affected, it's also invertebrates. Like this frog here is suffering from 𝗬𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙 affects the skin of the frog, and frogs are amphibians, so they use their skin for breathing. And when this kind of engulfs the frog, it usually they are not able to breathe properly, and they die due to asphyxiation when they're not able to breathe properly, and then they suffocate to death, which is again a very painful way to die. And it's not just one frog that is affected. This usually spreads to other frogs and other species in the particular surroundings. So yeah, one individual animal getting there usually spreads this disease, and parasites spreads into other animals as well. This also brings me to reproductive strategies in the wild, right? So this point will help me illuminate the amount of suffering that exists in the wild, and why it's usually in the wild the amount of suffering is much higher than any positive experiences the animals undergo. So a lot of animals reproduce in ways in which they give birth to huge number of offsprings. For example, turtles, they give birth to 600 turtle eggs. And to maintain stability, a lot of these animals die very young. For example, humans, for example, we give birth to few offsprings and we give a lot of care. But a lot of species in the wild, they do not have access to this kind of parental care. Majority of the invertebrates and also mammals, they give birth to huge number of offsprings, out of which many animals are born and they die very young. For example, turtles, a lot of them come onto the road due to anthropogenic causes. They might come onto the road or are eaten by predators. So out of the 600 turtles, very few might end up surviving. And also turtles, it's not just one time giving birth, right? They give birth 9 times, and each time they give birth to close to 600 offsprings. So you can imagine 9 times 600 offsprings, and majority of them die. And when you consider certain animals like bullfrogs, they might give as many as up to 20,000 offsprings on average. So you can imagine the number of animals that come into existence. And most of these animals that come into existence, they don't make it to a long time to maturity. They die very young. They die usually due to parasitic infections, of starvation. Sometimes when a frog gives birth in a pond, the pond might end up drying. So almost all of the tadpoles might end up dying. But this is a very common form of reproduction in the wild, where one animal gives birth to many offsprings, and based on the way they have been adapted, most of them end up dying to maintain the stability of the ecosystem. Most of them end up dying very young. So the only experience they have is of terrible suffering, dying due to starvation, parasitism, disease, predation, and they don't even have any kind of positive experiences since the time of their birth. So yeah, you can just imagine if there are so many animals in the wild, and majority of the animals use this form of reproduction, where majority of the individuals die very young, where they experience only suffering and pain, then this is the kind of, it's reasonable to assume that there is a lot of suffering happening in the wild. But we need not be pessimistic that we cannot do anything, because humans are already doing a lot of activities to help animals harmed in the wild. For example, this is an example of an elk which is stuck in a frozen pond, where humans, it happens very occasionally that humans do go out of their way and try to help the animals stuck in the frozen waters. Similarly, we've also noticed cases where turtles come out onto the road. There are volunteers going and trying to help the turtles from coming onto the road and giving them care. Sometimes when turtles are orphaned or injured, there is encouragement to go out of our way and help them. Similarly, during weather events as well, we've all recently seen the terrible forest fires that happened in Australia. A lot of humans did intervene. There was a large spread concern, for example, for koalas. Yeah, a lot of animals were not considered, but for example, it is still possible, koalas were given medical assistance, they were given access to water, to food, and they were taken care of as much as possible. Similarly, I think we are all aware of, the stranding of dolphins and whales that happens, along the shores of many species. This, for example, is in New Zealand, where, there was a stranding of whales, and people did, they did have intrinsic motivation to come and pull them back into the water, because they did care for the well-being of these animals. So yeah, we can still see that even for example, there's a lot of wildlife rehabilitation centers where certain species of animals are given care. If, for example, they're orphaned or if they are injured, they are given care and then released back into the wild. Yeah, and it's not just animals in the wild, even urban wild animals. Squirrels, for example, a lot of mother squirrels sometimes they do not come back to the nest, and the squirrels fall down from the nest and they get injured. And in these cases, it is very sensitive for the mother. It's not possible for the mother to pick the baby squirrel back into the safe zone. So usually they end up abandoning the babies. So a lot of people actually go out of their way to help the squirrels. A lot of urban animals like pigeons, squirrels, yeah. And it's not just helping individual animals. It is also possible to help animals on large scale. For example, this is an example in Turkey during the cold weather conditions. People, whenever it's cold and there is no access to food, people do leave large amount of grains for deers to feed on, and deers do actually feed on them. They are actually benefited by these interventions where we try to help animals in the large scale. However, I must say that feeding animals is a little bit sensitive, because feeding them might lead to their overpopulation and sometimes cause some kind of a conflict as well. But my point is to show that it is possible to help animals in large scale. And also, as I mentioned, diseases are very common in the wild. A lot of animals are affected by diseases. There is work already being done, but this work is, for example, you can see this paper was written in 1988. This was regarding vaccinating wild animals against rabies. So we humans do actually go and help animals in the wild when it is beneficial for humans or for animals that live with humans, to protect from zoonotic diseases, or to protect domestic animals from being harmed by the wild animals. So we did help the wild animals against rabies, but it was usually for anthropocentric reasons. But it did actually also benefit the animals living in the wild. So in many parts of the world, rabies has been largely eradicated. The way it worked was, they put the vaccine against rabies in a small cookie, in a biscuit, and they went up in a helicopter dropping, the biscuits all around the place, in tasty biscuits, and animals did consume them. And many parts of North America and Europe are now free of rabies due to this intervention. Right. So one of the major objection we get when we talk about this is that, people would not be open to helping animals in the wild, that, we should only be helping animals that are affected by humans and not, disturb the animals that are living in the wild. Or we should not go out of their way to help them. So we did do, the organization I work in, which is Animal Ethics, we did conduct a survey among scholars from universities across the world in Australia, Europe, and North America, and the scholars were from the life sciences department, who are already working in a way in ecology or in animal welfare science, for example. So we did conduct a survey asking them for their opinions on which kind of interventions would they support. And we did find these three interventions to be largely supported, which is vaccinating animals against diseases, helping urban wild animals, for example, as I mentioned, squirrels or pigeons, and also helping animals during terrible weather conditions like during floods, volcanic eruption, earthquakes. So we found out that these three forms of helping animals in the wild was more widely accepted. So yeah, it is still possible, to influence universities and scholars to work on these issues. Yes, so as I told you, the scale of suffering in the wild is too huge, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because humans do go out of their way and try to help animals, but there is not like a widespread concern regarding helping animals in the wild. Because usually the focus is on conservationist reasons. Like, there is a difference between focusing on conservation and difference between focusing on individual well-being. Conservationists usually focus on, the concern is mainly for the species or the ecosystem or the biodiversity, which are not really sentient, right? The sentient beings among those are the individual wild animals, which are capable of suffering and feeling pain. So yeah, like when we focus on individual well-being, sometimes it might conflict with preservation of ecosystem. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we at Animal Ethics are trying to create this kind of a concern and helping animal advocates and, effective altruists and the general public learn more about how animals are harmed and how we can help them. So we've been doing this since through multiple ways. For example, we are translating the information which is available into multiple different languages. So far, our website is available in 8 different languages, in Portuguese, in French, in German, in Chinese, in Hindi. So we have translated our website into multiple languages to make it more accessible to people from different regions. And also we've published recently a video course, the different ways I've told you in which animals suffer is a brief. If you would like to learn more about it in detail, then I would encourage you to go to our YouTube channel. The channel name is Animal Ethics. We've published 24 videos where you can get much more detailed knowledge about how animals suffer in the wild and what are the different ways in which we can help them. And we've also released an ebook, which contains, a very extensive, it's an introduction, but it contains an extensive, it's a extensive resource book, which contains different arguments, how animals suffer and what we can do to help them. And so a lot of people ask, what can they contribute? How can they contribute? And, what we can do to help animals in the wild. And as I said, there is this belief about speciesism. It's a very prevalent belief in our society where, we disregard the interests of non-human animals, and we say that their interests do not matter. For example, certain species are considered like dogs or cats, which are usually, we are very accustomed to consider. But certain species like, for example, say a hen, a fish, or, a honeybee, we don't usually consider their well-being. So what you can do is we do outreaches regularly. If you're interested, you can reach out to us and we'd be happy to provide you with resources to, to conduct outreaches. Yeah, so we do outreaches across the world where we spread information to general public about speciesism. Similarly, we also give seminars like this one. We give it in different universities where we talk to academics about what they can do or how they can help. I'll be introducing you to welfare biology in the further slides, but yeah, we do give the same talk that I'm giving to you now. Similar talks we do give in multiple universities across the world. For example, in Brazil right now, we are conducting courses in 2 universities where we are reaching out to more than 200 students, educating them about speciesism, about how animals suffer in the wild and what they can do to help them. This is a similar talk that I gave here in India. We've also been we've given in this year so far, in the previous year, we've given close to 12 talks in India, where a lot of students and academics have now become aware about wild animal suffering. Right. So one of the most important ways in which we can address wild animal suffering is by doing more research on it. As I've mentioned before, so far the academic work that has been done or the kind of work that's been influencing how we interact with animals is through is through fields of study which view animals as, in a very abstract sense, like as ecology, where they view like, ecosystem in general. There's very less studies done from the perspective of individual well-being of animals. So animal ethics and other organizations working on this space are trying to form this new field of study, which is welfare biology, which is a cross-disciplinary study, right? So for example, if we want to help animals in the wild, we should also consider, how their relation with other animals is, how their position in ecosystem affects, their well-being. So for this reason, it is very important to, inculcate how the information that has been, researched by ecology, by animal welfare science, by ethology, and many different disciplines. And welfare biology is this cross-disciplinary study where we try to find out how the well-being of animals in the wild is affected. Yeah. And we've been also funding and promoting welfare biology in multiple different universities. We've conducted a lot of studies and reports. For example, we've funded a study in Madrid, Spain, where we try to find out how wild animals are affected during forest fires and what can be done to help them. Similarly, we've funded a study in New Zealand regarding how we can help whales during beach strandings. And we've also published many reports regarding, regarding what is the consensus, how to form this new field of study, which is welfare biology. Like we've noticed that in, for example, animal welfare science, there was huge public support, to form this field of study, which is animal welfare science. But animal welfare science mainly focuses on domesticated animals or captive wild animals. It does not focus on animals living in the wild. So there is a very important need to form this field of study which focuses on animals living in the wild. So we've done, there's a lot more work which is available on our website. If you're interested, you can go through the studies on our website. And as I mentioned, right, it's not just the near term, like, the animals existing now that will be benefited by, spreading concern and implementing interventions that will help them from being harmed. It's also the animals that are suffering in the long-term future, which can also include, if, for example, sentient animals, and like promoting concern and, helping interventions that are already supported, like, supporting interventions that are already supported, at least for anthropocentric reasons, but do cause like a positive effect for, in the next 20 or 30 years for helping animals, in the larger scale. Right. So yes, so this was a brief introduction about what are the different ways in which animals are harmed, and why we should consider their interests seriously, and why we should reject speciesism, and also some of the ways in which we can help them. So if you're interested in volunteering or contributing to this cause, please do reach out to us. We would be happy to find out ways in which you can contribute to this growing issue. And thank you so much. And yeah, I would pass it on to Selena.
So thank you, Aditya. That was a really interesting talk. So we have a bunch of questions on Slido. And so I'll just ask you these questions now, taking the most popular ones first, and you can answer them.
Sure.
2 seconds. I'll just minimize Zoom here. Okay. So one question that has gotten a lot of votes is, can we not cause more harm by interfering in nature? What would you say to this?
Right. That's a really good question. And that's a very common question as well, because the usual assumption is that whenever humans have intervened in nature, we have ended up causing more harm to animals than, helping them out. For example, with climate change or deforestation. Yeah, so that's the reason we're promoting more research, like through the field of welfare biology, to understand how we can intervene in, or how we can help animals in the wild without causing them more harm, or how we can help animals throughout a particular region by positively rather than affecting them negatively. Yeah, so that's one reason. And it also assumes that, that right now animals are in the perfect condition, like, their welfare is overall positive. But that's not the case. As I mentioned, right now in the wild, most of the animals are actually suffering due to multiple reasons and due to the existing reproductive strategies. So, the situation is not good. So whatever we do to help them, it's very important that we need to research how we can help them without causing them further harm. And I hope that answers your question.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. Another question that has got a lot of votes is a question by Nick, who's asking you. It's interesting that you mentioned speciesism. Where do we draw the line with sentient animals that are considered as pests? For example, rats, cockroaches, and mosquitoes.
Sure. Yeah, that's again. So it's a very interesting question. So when I talk about sentience, it means any animal, any individual being that has the capacity to feel, pain and pleasure, which can also include animals that we classify as pests or classify as vermin. But these animals do equally have, interest in not suffering and not feeling pain. So they do also, want to live a life, by not being hunted, by not being poisoned. So it also makes sense to consider their interests as well, because they are also suffering. So wherever possible, we should try to find ways in which we can, help them as much as possible and not cause harm to them unless necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is, what are some ways that we can help wild animals in our personal lives?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's many things that we can do to help wild animals. So for example, even in the places where we live, there are a lot of urban wild animals, as I mentioned, pigeons, or like, for example, in India, we have like a lot of pigeons here and a lot of crows. Sometimes it helps to, whenever they are injured, taking them to, a hospital. Or I think one of the most important things which we can do is spreading concern about wild animal suffering. Is breaking this myth that nature is very idyllic, that all the animals in the wild are living beautiful lives, they are not suffering, and that we must not intervene in nature. I think we can do one of the most important things is to have conversations with people, through outreach, through seminars, or just personal conversations, and try to help them understand why it is very important to help animals in the wild and to reject speciesism. Yeah, there's helping the animals around you. If you're an academic, for example, you can in your research studies, you can also include concern for like welfare biology, for example, include how animals are affected in the wild. If you're an ecologist, you can include the perspective of how animals are harmed by different ecological interventions. Yeah, or if you're working in sociology, for example, if you're studying sociology, you can also try to understand the attitudes of that the current society has towards helping animals in the wild. So having more kind of studies and knowledge building up in this field will will equip us to help animals in large scale in the future. So I think, yeah, there's different ways which we can do. One is just outreach, conducting research, having conversations. So yeah, these are some of the effective ways I think in which we can help them. And also, if you're interested in contributing to organizations working on this field, I would welcome you to reach out to Animal Ethics. You can find our email on the website. Please do reach out, and we would definitely help you, support you in contributing to this cause.
That sounds cool. Thank you. That's very interesting. Actually, since I became aware of animal ethics and your work on wild animal suffering, I have also taken like personal action in my life. This is a little bit controversial, and many people are like, what? How can you what? That's just weird. But I started avoiding walking on grass, for example, because I saw an estimate that there are at least 1,000 insects living in 1 square meter of grass. So I stopped walking on grass whenever possible, although sometimes I can't really avoid it. But yeah, so that's just like one very specific way that I, in my personal life, try to do something.
Yeah, that's very interesting. For example, I also have seen some videos of people helping honeybees, for example, when they get disoriented and fall down, people try to feed them sugar water and try to help them through that. So I think there's multiple possibilities of helping, sentient beings around you. I think it's just a matter of paying attention and, gaining knowledge. Yeah,
like walking where you, like watching where you walk. And I also tend to like move in little snails or worms to the side so that people don't step on them. Anyways, next question. So that is Lucas, who asks you, what do you think could be an effective intervention to slow down the nascent field of insect farming? Ooh, very interesting question.
Right. Yeah, that's an amazing question, and it's a very important question as well, because right now, due to multiple reasons, people are shifting to farming insects in large numbers. And as we've seen, there is growing evidence that insects are actually sentient. A lot of the insects that are farmed are sentient, and they feel pain and pleasure. So these insects, when they're farmed in such huge numbers in very terrible conditions, the amount of suffering is magnified by bounds. And so I think it's very important to, not promote insect farming. And regarding his question, which is effective interventions, I think certain organizations are working on kind of navigating away from insect farming. For example, Rethink Priorities is currently conducting a study. I think it was a form of a fly which is being farmed to feed livestock. And what they are trying to do is trying to reach out to governments and trying to influence policy to avoid farming insects or to discourage farming insects. And as we know, most of the governments or the policymakers are speciesist in their thoughts. They don't give equal consideration to insects. So yeah, it is very important that we promote concern in the public against insect farming as well, because if it does prove out to be that insects feel pain and they suffer, then as we have evidence for, then it's a disaster in making. Yeah,
I agree. It's very scary, isn't it? So Lucas has another really good question, which is, which wild animal support issues or causes were least supported by scholars?
Yeah. So strategically, it makes sense, at least when you're promoting this field, because it's in a very nascent stage. And as we know, the prevalent attitude when intervening in the wild is usually for anthropocentric reasons. So it makes sense to promote interventions which are, already being done for other reasons, like vaccinating animals to protect, farmed animals, or to protect from zoonotic diseases. Yeah, so there were a lot of interventions which they find controversial. For example, contraception is one of them. So yeah, like animals are hunted for, whenever there's overpopulation of animals or human-animal conflict. So people usually, without thinking, they resort to hunting. So if you were actually concerned about the well-being of animals, you would choose harmless ways of solving this problem, which is contraception. It's actually being used in multiple countries and has also historically been used. For example, horses in North America, when there was overpopulation of wild horses, contraception was used, and it was actually helping control the situation. Similarly in India as well. So yeah, there's a lot of controversial ones, but I wouldn't want to talk about them in this talk. But for example, contraception is one of them. The major concern for them was, it would affect, the other ecosystemic relations, and it would harm other animals when we try to help one particular species of animal. So yeah, that was the major concern, that, it can have negative flow-through effects.
Yeah, and that's why you highlight research into how we can help wild animals without causing more harm, right?
Exactly. It's I think these two are the major points, which is, one is promoting the field of welfare biology and anti-speciesism, and the second one is supporting the interventions which are already being done in the wild that help wild animals, even if it's for other reasons. Yeah,
that makes sense. So the next question is, if I donated $1 billion to you for use on direct action, how would you spend it?
Great. I'd be very happy if you donate $1 billion to me, first of all. And I think, as I mentioned, one of the major major focuses right now is to promote the field of welfare biology, which is establishing this into established universities, making this a respected field of study, and encouraging more and more academics, funding more and more academics to conduct more studies. For example, how to measure the welfare of animals in the wild, or for example, how animals are harmed by different reasons, and how to help animals without causing negative harm. So yeah, I think these are some of the questions we would help fund academics for, and also create this field of welfare biology. And I think this is one of the most important things to do right now, is to create more awareness about this issue through academic and outreach. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. So I don't know if people noticed, but we already said it a few times, but the questions are in Slido and there is links in the chat and you can upvote the questions that you most like, although we don't have that much time left. Although there are so many good questions, I hope we can take most of them.
Happy to answer.
So the next one is, are there not more animals in factory farms than in nature?
Yeah, you'd think so. But as I mentioned, right, for example, in factory farms, I've read these estimates that currently there are 25 billion farmed animals, at least, if I consider the larger animals like hens and cows and fishes. I'm not including fishes. As I mentioned, the number of fishes is like 2 trillion wild-caught fishes, and farmed fishes might also exceed the number. But the number of animals in the wild is much, much, much larger. As I mentioned, the majority of animals in the wild are invertebrates, the insects, which give birth to huge number of animals, like, for example, a bullfrog giving birth to 20,000 offsprings, out of which 1 or 2 survive. So a lot of individuals come into existence, but they die very soon. And the number of animals in the wild is much, much larger than the factory farmed animals. So I think it deserves more, consideration right now. Yeah.
Right, thanks. So would the moral case for helping animals be helped by the fact that people's actions are not so directly linked to the suffering of the animal?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question?
Would the moral case for helping animals be helped by the fact that people's actions are not so directly linked to the suffering of the animal?
Yes, actually, that does make sense, and we've also seen that through, for example, if, for example, a particular way of helping animals is not directly linked to a person causing harm, then a person is more likely to help them. For example, whales, when they are stranded on the beach due to natural causes, then people are more likely to help them. Rather than, for example, when harm is directly connected to a person, like eating a particular wild animal or hunting a particular wild animal, where he's more reluctant to kind of change his behavior. So I think what is very important is changing the attitudes of people, right? Like addressing the core problem, which is speciesism. And once they make sense of it, then the actions flow through it. And yeah, I think that is what we need to focus on, which is this prevailing attitude of speciesism. And yeah, that definitely makes sense, at least through the behavioral studies that have been conducted. When we try to focus on interventions which are not directly connected, then it's more likely that a person would support that intervention. Yeah.
Cool. So there's so many great questions left, but I'm afraid we don't have time for all of them. So we'll take the last one. And I just want to let everyone who wasn't here in the beginning know that there is the possibility to join local discussion groups for those who want to discuss this further, want to know more about wild animal suffering and dive deeper into it. So you can join the local discussion groups in just a few minutes. So just taking the last question is, should we exterminate predators?
Huh. So yeah, actually predation is a very, a big source of suffering in the wild, but there are many bigger sources of suffering in the wild. Like, as I mentioned, diseases are much more common in the wild. Parasitism is much more common in the wild. And predation is not something which would be effective, at least in the short term, because people, first of all, wouldn't agree with it. And eliminating predators, we are not really aware of how the trophic chains are linked. When I say trophic chains, it means, the dependence of one animal on the other animal for food. So eliminating predators might have might cause a trophic cascade, which is that, the total, it might be like, more harm caused rather than benefit through predation. And we need more information. And due to predation, it's not just the prey that suffer, but also predators. For example, a lion or a crocodile goes, hungry for many days before it actually is successful in hunting an animal. So predation is a very serious form of harm caused in the wild. But right now, it's not, it's not an effective means of reducing suffering in the wild. And I think we should focus more on the accepted forms of intervention already, as we've seen previously, which is vaccination, helping animals during weather events, and helping them from diseases. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I hope so too. So yeah, this was so great. It was such an interesting talk and such great answers to people's questions. I just wish we could have like made it to go through all the questions because they were like so good. But as I just said, please join the local discussion groups and perhaps you can get answers to your questions there. And so I will pass on the word to my fellow effective altruist member, Carmen, who will now just share something with you, and she will also take over for the discussion groups, which I hope you will join.
Thank you so much, Elaine.
Thank you too, Aditya.